A Fluxus Essay, Dorothy Iannone. I am she who is not Fluxus. I am she who is cared for by many Fluxus men. I am she who cares for these same men. Out of a loving concern for my eventual placement in the history of art, and out of a desire to render the image of Fluxus more harmonious with the universe, Ben Vautier has included me in this exhibition. I am to be, in a sense which may reveal itself in the course of this essay, the Fluxus woman. It is characteristic of the ideally anarchistic spirit of Fluxus that a woman artist who is not a Fluxus artist should be the Fluxus woman artist. And that's why I like Fluxus. It's always telling me I can do anything I want, and I like my ways to be confirmed and blessed. Let the story begin with some lines from a song I once wrote for Robert Filiou, a song which gives a passing tribute to the powers of Emmett Williams and recalls the significance of my union with Diderot, the Imponderable, who may well be he who is not Fluxus. Long ago in Antibes, in Carpe d'Antibes, I met you and loved you, and still do today. You captured my mind, dear. I touched your French soul. Now look where we find ourselves, in this German hole. Our lives touched and changed, dear, long ago in Antibes. Now I'm for the jungle, and he's for the sky. You led me to Emmet, and he to a ship, and we sailed northward to Reykjavik. Long ago, you know where, you, in Iceland somewhere, I met you and loved you, and that changed my life. In the early spring of 1966, in the garden of Albert Ferraud in Cap d'Aille, Robert and Marianne Filiou and Dorothy Iannone looked at each other and found something they had not known before. The Filious presented her that same evening in Villefranche to George Brecht, her compatriot, who thought she was a Frenchwoman. I think George was eating snails which Donna Jo Jones had prepared for him, but I cannot swear to this. Then, with the 5-year-old Marcel Filiou on Dorothy's lap, the Filious drove with her and her husband to Cap d'Antibes, to the villa the Uphams, for so she was called then, had rented for a season. During the journey, Marcel suddenly turned around and silently kissed Dorothy full on the lips. In Cap d'Antibes, Dorothy received them with escalope de veau pané and her paintings, and they began to cement their friendship. Contemplating one of Dorothy's large canvases, Robert, seated before it, fell asleep. When he woke up again, he danced for them. A few days later, Marianne and Robert received Dorothy and her husband with Danish hamburgers. Another day, they drove to Marseille to meet Robert's brother Marcel. En route to Paris, They stopped in Sauve to have lunch with Robert's mother. Somewhere along the line, they discovered that Robert had lived for some months in East Boston, that obscure hole where Dorothy was born. They like to say they are both Saracens whose destinies have touched each other's. In Paris, they introduced her to Daniel Sperry, who received Dorothy and her husband James with a light lunch of beef testicles in cream sauce and a cucumber salad. Attracted to Daniel, who could not permit himself to trust her, Dorothy provoked him continuously. Now, many years later, after many shared experiences, see Story of Bern, Dorothy Iannone, published by D. Roth and D. Iannone, Düsseldorf, 1970. Dorothy treads lightly, and Daniel is inclined to believe, at least intellectually, in her sweetness. Perhaps one lifetime is not enough for them to embrace each other unreservedly. Dorothy has started believing that if she is granted 47 more years, she will be able to realize herself and to drop out of the merry-go-round. And if that is true, they will only imperfectly recognize each other in paradise as they do on earth. So now, she who is not Fluxus, who has never heard of Fluxus, but who already makes books and writes poetry into her paintings, she who makes cutouts of presidents and other people with their sex bravely visible, flies back with her husband to New York. She has been given Emmett Williams' telephone number by Robert, and she contacts the stranger as soon as her courage allows. He comes to her house one evening, and she receives him with a chicken pâté hors d'oeuvre before she and her husband invite him for the rest of the dinner to a Spanish restaurant on McDougal Street, where she had once dined with Henry Miller and his publisher and friends. Emmett becomes a frequent guest at 38 West 12th Street, and Dorothy takes pleasure in preparing her finest dishes for his consideration. Frequently they lunch alone together in restaurants, and Dorothy learns to drink deeply and with lucidity. I don't remember what they talk about, but they please each other. And her last year in New York is filled with the remembrance of that Southern gentleman and scholar, of that wizard Emmett Williams. Recently they came together again, and the exuberance of their evenings was intensified by the lives they have led since then and the loves they have kept. They look forward to Emmett's 1980 sojourn in Berlin, where once again they will share the details of each other's lives and perhaps make again their spontaneous performances. In 1973, after Dieter Roth's opening at the ICA in London, all the best lovers went to a restaurant, and Emmett and Dorothy, quite off the cuff, performed a little piece. Richard Hamilton teased and saluted, saying it must have been rehearsed all week. And in Iceland once, that great original, Emmett Williams I speak of still, took off his glasses and rolled all the way down an enormous hill. He simply let himself go with gravity. Surely it was the goddess protecting him, shielding his head from the numerous stones which lay in his path. The goddess, too, it must have been, who brought him Annie, his beautiful wife, and Gary, his beautiful child. Emmett enchanted Dorothy and her husband so that in 1967 they agreed to make a sea voyage with him. See Sondern, Notes for an Autobiography, Dorothy Iannone, number 3, published by Seedorn Verlag, Zurich, 1978. He led them to Dieter Roth in Reykjavik, who received them with a very fresh fish under his arm. See Danger in Düsseldorf, Dorothy Iannone, Hans-Jörg Meyer Verlag, Stuttgart, 1973. And there Dorothy separated her destiny from that of her husband's. In July of 1967, Dieter and Dorothy left Iceland to begin their German days. They flew with Emmett, who intended to visit his family in Darmstadt. Their plane made a 1-hour stopover in Copenhagen. Drinking beer and schnapps in the airport bar, conversing in their everyday exultant manner, they cleverly managed to miss the takeoff. And so they lightheartedly took a bus into Copenhagen to extend their memorable hours together. On the last of their 3 days in that northern clamp, see postscript, they were received by Adi and Tut Köpke with beer and schnapps and Eric Andersen. On future visits to Copenhagen, see North number 78, issue dedicated to Arthur Köpke, letter from Dorothy Iannone, published by Bengt Petersen, Roskilde, Denmark, 1979. Dorothy and Adi and Tut would come to care for each other. On this meeting, they were all rather knocked out by the clamor of so many big guns sitting around together. What a year. Now Dieter and Dorothy bring their love to Cologne, and in these days they are still brilliant lovers. After adventures irrelevant to this history, they drive with Thomas and Maruta Schmidt to Basel. The always enigmatic and appealing Thomas compliments Dieter on his woman. He makes the compliment in a way which moves that woman once and for all to believe in Thomas's strength. In 1968, Maruta and Thomas would receive Dieter and Dorothy in their Bleibtreustrasse apartment with a Berlin breakfast. And a few hours later, taken to the airport by René Bloch, Dieter would find a moment to whisper again his marriage proposal to Dorothy in order to save her pleasure. In 1971, Thomas translated into German Dorothy's complimentary and uncomplimentary cards. And these days in Berlin, they are conversationally inventing pieces they say they will do together. It was on this Berlin visit in 1968 that Dieter and Dorothy and a few friends knocked up Lugo Gosewitz after midnight because Dieter had heard that Lugo was broke. Lugo received them with warmth despite the hour, and they all went out for a few soothing drinks. 3 or 4 years later, Lugo visited Dorothy in Düsseldorf. She received him with drinks and brought him to Spörri's restaurant for dinner. He amazed her with his facial transformation, a frequent feat for Lugo, it seems, but the first she had ever experienced. They talked and talked and talked, and they were not sure if they had anything in the hand. Later, these days in Berlin, they come together here and there as maybe close cousins, although there have been 2 man-woman encounters between them, each one lasting perhaps 4 or 5 rapturous seconds. They are so fine in their sensibilities, Lugo and Dorothy, that even these 10 seconds keep their relationship alive and trembling. They have been wanting to exchange works of art for the last few years, and soon they will do it. In Basel in the fall of 1967, Dieter and Dorothy, the new configuration, received Robert and Marianne Filiou and George Brecht in their attic rooms with one of 20 bottles of Karl Gerstner's gin, which he had carelessly offered because he did not know that lucid drinkers could consume what he considered almost a lifetime supply in less than a month. George Brecht stayed for a week with Dieter and Dorothy. They listened to a Mozart recording which Robert Motherwell had in 1958 presented Dorothy. Celebrating this moment, they sent him a postcard, care of his New York gallery. In addition to their own names, Dorothy added, 3 beauties in Basel. If he received it, did he believe it? One evening, George helped Dieter with the mold heaps, Schimmelhaufen. Was it 200 or only 50 which Dieter was then making for the firm of Gerstner, Gredinger, and Kutter? Joyously, George and Dieter added to the already heaped pieces of old bread and other interesting materials with which Dieter was slowly covering all his wooden squares by peeing on each piece. George admired Dorothy's work then and has continued to defend it, no small ally in the art wars, to use Robin Page's friendly expression. She was proud to show Ben George's recommendation for her to the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst the moment it arrived in Saint-Germain in 1975. Ben was impressed, she could tell from his face. George had written that Dorothy Iannone's place in contemporary art is unique. She works in an area practically untouched by anyone else. When she wanted to include this statement in her DAD catalog in 1977, she called up George to ask his permission and read him the sentence. Yes, he said, it's still true. And just this moment, 7:02 p.m., December 3rd, 1979, to make the remark as temporally actual as possible, she called him up in Cologne, and George was happy to confirm his belief that the statement still is true. She also read him the opening of this piece, which pleased him. So these were the Basel days. She almost got pneumonia. She crawled up the stairs with her bare ass in her lover's face. He left her alone in this dismal Ausstrasse, in this town where she had no friends. But she began her dialogues. She began to use the man as her muse. She found the way to find herself. And their love survived even Switzerland. In the spring of 1968, Dieter and Dorothy went to live in Düsseldorf, where Dieter was to be professor at the Thekunst Academy. I think Joseph Beuys was responsible for Dieter's invitation to that school. We invited him and his wife to dinner once, along with the Filius, but the invitation was never reciprocated. I think Beuys was angry with Dieter because Dieter accepted into his class any student who wished to enter it. It was only some years later that Beuys himself utilized with great acclaim this idea which, as far as I can see, originated with Dieter. Dieter and Dorothy and Daniel Spurri and Karl Gersner and a few other people invited the Filius to come from Villefranche to Düsseldorf in 1968. That move changed the course of Robert's life, it seems, for it was in Germany that finally, for him as well as for many of us, the world began slowly, very slowly, to say yes. George Brecht came from London, Takako Sato from her European wanderings, and Robin and Carol Page from Leeds. The beauties converged on Düsseldorf and offered the Rhine a few enchanted years. It is not possible to speak of Düsseldorf without mentioning Eric and Dorothy Anders, those sweet people who have, with the greatest of pleasure, shared their place with so many of Fluxus's darlings. One day, in 1968, Eric Dietzmann visited Dieter and Dorothy received Eric with a black ciré jumpsuit. Later, Eric and Dorothy received each other with more and more delicious dishes. When, in 1971 or 72, Eric came to live in Düsseldorf for 1 year, he and Dorothy drank oceans of vodka together like the angels they are. They both have a sensational staying power. They were living now in a graying Düsseldorf, for slowly their other friends were leaving it. They had no difficulty in agreeing with each other. They supported each other marvelously, and they always smiled at each other. See Dorothy's contribution to the Eric Dietzmann catalogue, Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, Art 2, 1975. Whenever Dorothy wants to remind Eric of the sacredness of their relationship, she has only to recount the story of the night in Paris in 1975 when Eric telephoned her at 3 o'clock in the morning at the apartment where she was staying, waking her and urgently asking that she come to fetch him at a certain bar in Montparnasse because, although he wanted very badly to leave that bar, it seemed he was incapable of doing it alone. Dorothy tried hard through the telephone to give him the strength to leave because she really hated to get out of her warm bed and go out into the night. But Eric insisted on his need, and so she accepted the summons, made herself beautiful, and within an hour or so, she and Eric were happily strolling the early morning streets of Paris. How many early mornings in Europe they have seen together. And now, for different reasons, they are both frequenting Copenhagen, and they look forward to the possibility of another time around. I once wrote a short song for Eric, but now I remember only the last line. Eric, oh Eric, you know on Thursdays I don't like to cry. In 1969, Benjamin Patterson passed through Düsseldorf and telephoned the Filius who were living in Dorothy's studio. Robert and Marianne and Dorothy went to the railroad station to have a drink with him. I don't remember if Benjamin too cleverly managed to miss his train, but somehow he came back to the Drakestrasse apartment. Robert went to sleep, Dieter kept on being asleep, and Marianne and Dorothy entertained Benjamin, who finally slept on the couch, embraced Dieter in the morning as Dorothy saw with one half-opened eye, and left. In New York, Benjamin received Dorothy with pre-roasted chickens and Danish ice cream. Dorothy received Benjamin with baked red snapper. Robert Filiu says that Benjamin was the first black avant-garde artist in America, and Benjamin said that he stopped making art because he felt that other people could do the same thing he was doing, and he wanted to find some place where his function would be unique. Benjamin's grandfather was a man of the cloth, after whom a certain species of butterfly is named, because he first discovered or isolated it. In the summer of 1969, still wearing a little Band-Aid to cover my new and not yet accepted appendix scar, I rented a house on the water in the east end of Provincetown for the month of August. Benjamin came to stay with me for some days. Every morning I would cook Portuguese sausage and fried eggs for us, and Benjamin, privy to my passion for my neighbor Norman Mailer, would tease me now and then, running into the kitchen from the deck to tell me that my idol was, just at that moment, coming down the beach. And in 1969, while I was still recovering from that tricky appendix operation, Robin and Carol Page came to live in Düsseldorf. One day, Dieter brought Robin to meet me in the hospital. I received them with a black old lace covering, which displeased neither Robin nor Carol, for whom I also wore it a few days later on her first visit with Marianne. These were our initial intense years together, and from the beginning we acknowledged our familial ties. Now in Berlin, after many intervening years when our lives did not meet, we have renewed our friendship. We feel so mellow and comfortable that we are able to help each other, even through the telephone, at those moments when we need comfort. In 1971, Robin, on the long-distance telephone, suggested to Dorothy that she write a song. A few hours later, she called him back in London from Düsseldorf and sang her first song to him, a song she had written for Dieter. You let me down, I never knew that I could come right up to you. You loved me and let me be free. I pleased you, now won't you please me, etc. And then, at the time of the Fluxus show in Köln, Dorothy met at last in the restaurant Sperry the great Ben. It was Emmett Williams, I think, who introduced them. Up to this moment she had only seen the back of his head, pictured on a certain well-known poster. She was amazed at his beauty and youth, which the back of his head had not led her to expect. They knocked themselves out impressing each other and agreed not to rush their relationship, perhaps because they unconsciously hoped to become the ideal brother and sister to each other. A little later, Annie and Ben received Dorothy in Nice with scores of tiny meatballs and a bottle of vodka. She is staggered when she remembers one of her extravagant acts, which was a gauge of her trust in him. After a wonderful evening with the Filius and the Vautiers, and at the moment of parting, Dorothy lay down on some street in Nice as Ben was driving his famous truck toward her. There on the ground, she placidly waited, knowing no harm would ever come to her through Ben. Twice she has said harsh things to him, so harsh that he was moved to silence. I don't think she ever will again. Once or twice he has even reciprocated. There was a moment a year ago when she could say that no one in the world except Ben was capable of moving her to fury. Now I have noticed that her famous patience extends even to the man who of all her friends she imagines is most like her. Before she came to understand their ideal connection to each other, she courted him with songs. One of them was, "And if the blue angel wants the archangel, how many people will cry? I don't deceive you, my looks are true. My mind won't leave you, it cares for you. I'm not inhuman, I'm soft as you. Perhaps you're softer or more afraid. But take a chance, my dear, just take a chance, my dear. You know some passions refuse to fade. Don't be a coward, don't make me blue. If you won't submit, what will I do?" Etc. Last summer, I brought my lover to meet Ben's mother, Janet Giraud, in Nice. Janet and I have been great friends for almost as many years as I have known Ben. I said, I can't present Eric Bock just now to Sarah Pucci, my mother, and so the next best thing is to bring him to you. Janet was made happy by this declaration, and even suggested that henceforth I call her Mama. Takako Sato came to live in Düsseldorf in 1969. Because she was broke, I asked her to decorate a dozen or so linen napkins for me in any way she chose. Takako made the tiniest detailed embroidered scenes imaginable on every napkin. If a man was sitting on a park bench wearing a little hat, Takako didn't forget to put a feather on that hat. The napkins turned out to be of such beauty that I have dared use them only once or twice, and then only the same 2 or 3. Recently, for a show she had in Köln, Takako asked all her friends to add something to her own works. For weeks I hesitated touching one of her pieces. I feared my contribution would negate the delicacy of her achievement. But with her desire for collaboration whispering in my mind, I found the way one evening to answer the delicacy of her work. Hal Hansen and I used to have a very effective routine together in 1967 in New York. We took our inspiration from Gone with the Wind. Al played Rhett Butler and I Scarlett O'Hara. We could talk to each other for hours in our perfectly phony but seemingly authentic Southern accents. I would not dream of speaking to him in any other way. There is an instance where I found immediately my ideal relationship with another. Dieter introduced Dorothy to Nam June Paik and to Joe Jones in New York in 1969 or 1970, both of whom she would see again at the Fluxus show in Berlin a few years after she and Dieter had regretfully acknowledged the end of their active journey together. Pike found her 1976 look superior to her 1970 aspect. In 1978, they sat across from each other at the Berlin Kongresshalle dinner table, a veal and rice affair, where Dorothy was to read her Berlin beauties. Because it was April 21st, Dieter Roth's birthday, they both wrote him a loving message on the printed menu. It may be that life will one day bring them closer together. She has a tendency to prefer his plump aspect to his present lean looks, but she is nonetheless curious to know if they can entertain each other. He has a talent to bring in a few seconds a little encounter to an interesting point. It starts out as seeming small talk, and then one is surprised to discover that one is almost in up to the waist. Joe Jones even came this year to live at Kreutzensteig 10 in Berlin, he says, because Dorothy is living there. She received him with Campari, and later that evening he received her at an Italian restaurant with mussels and rigatoni. They are going to make a concert together in Berlin. Dorothy's eyes get wide as Joe offers her the run of the 4 dismantled pianos in his studio. This will be the year they grow to know each other well. She can tell you that she met Bob Watts at that Fluxus show in Berlin, and that he wanted to photograph her in a certain T-shirt, the significance of which she forgets, and that she obliged. She cunningly and swiftly, for this was a spur-of-the-moment idea as the band was leaving the bar where they had been drinking for a few hours, arranged herself so that her bare midriff enhanced the T-shirt's message. She hopes she will see the photo one day. This year, Milan and Maria Knisak lived briefly in the Kreutzensteig studio which Joe Jones now occupies. Dorothy received them with very, very strong coffee, and then Maria fetched some food from their place and received Dorothy at her own table with kefir, Vierkornbrot, and cheese. They interest each other. Dorothy likes the seeming ease with which they speak frankly on all subjects. The story would not be complete without the appearance of George Masunis. During the Berlin Fluxus show, Dorothy drove Robert, who was staying at her place, to the Thekunst Academy, where the Fluxus maze was being built. A slight, wiry man with a black patch over one eye, once he had learned that I had a car, started giving Robert and me peremptory orders about which materials to rush out and purchase. Incensed by this authoritarian behavior from a man whom I assumed worked for the Academy, I said to Robert, "Who is this guy?" Masunis, Robert answered without apology. Later that afternoon, I sat with the Fluxus men downstairs in the Academy lounge while Masunis directed the structure of the festival. I was amazed at the power he had over everyone present. He clearly was in command. A few nights later, before their performance at the Academy, I went backstage, proud to be a privileged intimate. There, Masunis and I looked deeply but impassively into each other's eyes, not knowing then that we would meet again on these pages. Perhaps he was thinking, "Who is this woman?" Perhaps it might even have amused him, somewhere far back in his mind, to know that I am she who is the Fluxus woman artist, who is not the Fluxus woman artist. Berlin, December 1979. P.S. In 1968, Adi Köpke led me to a gallery in Copenhagen. And 9 years later, that gallery led me to an extraordinary priest. And this year, the priest and the artist, or the artist and the priestess, chose in each other their celestial, their eternal companion. Or at least, that is how matters now stand.